The frigid waters of the Sweetwater River rushed past Julia Murphy's feet as she huddled on the muddy bank, her shoulders shaking with each heart-wrenching sob. The letter that had shattered her world lay crumpled in her trembling hands, the ink smudged by her tears. Colorado Territory 1876 was proving to be as cruel as it was beautiful. "The water runs toward our future," a deep voice said from behind her. Julia startled, clutching her sodden handkerchief to her chest. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the setting sun, the brim of his hat casting shadows across features that seemed carved from the surrounding landscape. A stranger, yet somehow his words pierced through her despair. "I don't have a future," Julia replied bitterly, her voice hoarse from crying. "Not anymore." The stranger stepped closer, and she could see him properly now, a cowboy with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of the summer sky. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to harsh terrain and harsher circumstances. "Everyone's got a future, madam," he said, removing his hat respectfully. "Just like this river. Might hit some rough patches, but it keeps on flowing." He gestured toward the rushing water. "Name's Mason Porter." Julia studied him warily. At 22, she had learned to be cautious around strangers, especially men with kind words and kinder eyes. "Julia Murphy," she finally offered, discreetly trying to wipe away her tears. Mason nodded, keeping a respectful distance. "You're the school teacher who came in on last week's stagecoach." "I was to be," Julia admitted, looking down at the crumpled letter. "But it seems the position has been filled by someone more suitable." The word tasted bitter on her tongue. More suitable meaning someone who wasn't a woman traveling alone, someone who wasn't desperate enough to journey halfway across the country for a teaching position that paid barely enough to survive. "Suitable?" Mason's eyebrow arched as he settled his hat back on his head. "Forgive me for saying so, but Summit Springs could use some education. Most folks around here can barely write their own names." "Apparently they'd prefer to remain illiterate than be taught by me," Julia said, rising to her feet and brushing off her mud-stained skirts. Her brown traveling dress had seen better days, but it was all she had left after spending nearly everything on the journey west. "Their loss," Mason said simply. He glanced at the sun, which was sinking rapidly behind the mountains. "It'll be dark soon. Do you have somewhere to stay?" The question made fresh tears spring to Julia's eyes. She had spent her last coins on a room at the boarding house, thinking she would have her first week's pay before needing to pay again. Now, with no job and no money, she was truly stranded. "I'll manage," she lied, lifting her chin proudly. Mason studied her for a long moment. "Mrs. Hollister at the Double H Ranch is looking for help with her children, 3 little ones, all under the age of 10, and she's expecting another. Her husband's one of the biggest cattle ranchers in these parts." Hope flickered briefly in Julia's chest before dying. "I doubt they'd hire someone like me without references." "They might if I put in a good word," Mason said, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm their foreman." Julia blinked in surprise. Despite his worn clothing and dusty boots, there was an air of authority about him that she hadn't initially recognized. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" "Because everyone deserves a chance," he replied, offering his hand to help her up the steep riverbank. "And because I believe some things happen for a reason, even when they don't make sense at first." Julia hesitated, then placed her gloved hand in his. His grip was strong and steady as he helped her navigate the slippery incline. For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach into this rugged frontier town, she felt the smallest flicker of hope. "The ranch is about 5 miles north," Mason explained as they reached level ground. "I've got my horse tied up near the general store. I can take you there, if you're willing." Julia glanced back at the river, then toward the cluster of buildings that made up Summit Springs, the town that had rejected her before she'd even had a chance to prove herself. "Yes," she said finally, squaring her shoulders. "I'm willing." Mason nodded, a look of approval crossing his features. "Then, let's not waste daylight." The ride to Double H Ranch was mostly silent, with Julia perched awkwardly behind Mason on his sturdy chestnut gelding. She had never been this close to a man who wasn't family, and the impropriety of it made her cheeks burn. But necessity had a way of overruling propriety, and she had no other options. The ranch appeared as they crested a hill, a sprawling collection of buildings nestled in a valley, with cattle dotting the surrounding pastures. A two-story house stood proudly at the center, smoke curling from its chimney into the twilight sky. "It's beautiful," Julia murmured, almost to herself. "Hollisters have built something special here," Mason agreed, guiding his horse down the slope. "Started with nothing but a claim and determination 15 years ago." As they approached, a woman emerged onto the front porch, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other shading her eyes as she peered at the approaching riders. "Mason Porter, who on earth do you have riding with you?" she called, her voice carrying across the yard. Mason dismounted smoothly before helping Julia down. "Evening, Mrs. Hollister. This is Miss Murphy. She came to be Summit Springs' new teacher, but there's been some confusion about the position." Mrs. Hollister's expression softened as she took in Julia's bedraggled appearance. "Well, don't just stand there in the yard. Come inside and tell me everything." Over steaming cups of coffee at the Hollisters' kitchen table, Julia explained her situation, how she had sold nearly everything she owned back in Boston to purchase a stagecoach ticket west, only to find upon arrival that the school board had given the teaching position to the nephew of one of its members. "Disgraceful," Mrs. Hollister declared, her kind face flushing with indignation. "Those old fools on the board wouldn't know good sense if it bit them on their backsides. Pardon my language, dear." Mr. Hollister, a barrel-chested man with a surprisingly gentle manner, nodded in agreement. "Summit Springs has been trying to get a proper school going for 3 years now. Last fellow lasted 6 weeks before heading back east." "I would have stayed," Julia said quietly. "Teaching is all I've ever wanted to do." Mrs. Hollister exchanged a look with her husband. "Well, as it happens, we've been looking for someone to tutor our children. Proper schooling is hard to come by out here, and I won't have my little ones growing up without education." "Mason mentioned you might need help," Julia acknowledged, hope rising once again. "We can offer room and board, plus a small wage," Mr. Hollister said. "It's not much, but—" "I'll take it," Julia interrupted, then blushed at her eagerness. "That is, if you'll have me." And so it was decided. Julia would stay in the small room off the kitchen, teach the Hollister children during the day, and help with household duties when needed. It wasn't the independent position she had dreamed of, but it was a roof over her head and honest work more than she had an hour ago on that riverbank. That night, after being shown to her room by a visibly pregnant and tired Mrs. Hollister, Julia sat on the narrow bed and finally allowed herself to breathe. The room was simple but clean, with a small window that looked out toward the mountains. A far cry from her parents' comfortable home in Boston. But her parents were gone now, taken by the influenza that had swept through the city 2 years ago. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, hastily wiping her eyes. The door opened to reveal Mason, his tall frame nearly filling the doorway. He had removed his hat, and his dark hair curled slightly at the edges. "Just wanted to make sure you're settled," he said, remaining respectfully in the doorway. "The Hollisters are good people. You'll be safe here." "Thank you," Julia said, truly meaning it. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me by that river." Mason's expression was unreadable in the dim lamplight. "Like I said, the water runs toward our future. Sometimes we just need to trust the current." He paused, then added, "I'll be heading out at first light. I've got a cattle drive to prepare for, but I'll be back in a few weeks." Julia nodded, suddenly aware that this man was a stranger who had shown her extraordinary kindness. "Safe travels, Mr. Porter." "Mason," he corrected with a small smile. "Good night, Miss Murphy." "Julia," she replied softly. "And good night." After he left, Julia extinguished the lamp and lay back on the bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. For the first time since arriving in Colorado territory, she didn't feel completely adrift. The current had carried her here, to this place, to these people. Perhaps the cowboy was right. Perhaps the water did run toward their future. The following weeks passed in a blur of new routines and faces. Julia quickly formed a bond with the Hollister children, 10-year-old Emma, 8-year-old Thomas, and 5-year-old Sarah. They were bright and curious, if a bit wild from country living, and Julia found genuine joy in their daily lessons conducted in the ranch's sunny front room. Mrs. Hollister, "Call me Margaret, dear," was grateful for the help, especially as her pregnancy advanced. Her husband Daniel was kind but often absent, the demands of running a large cattle operation keeping him in the saddle from dawn till dusk. "How did you come to Colorado?" Julia asked one evening as she helped Margaret prepare dinner. Margaret smiled, resting a hand on her rounded belly. "Love, my dear. Daniel and I met back in Missouri when he was passing through with a cattle drive. He was just a cowhand then, not a rancher. But he had dreams bigger than the sky." Her eyes took on a faraway look. "He promised me mountains and valleys and a life that would never be dull. I was 19 and headstrong. My parents thought I was making the biggest mistake of my life." "And were you?" Julia asked, peeling potatoes with practiced efficiency. "Not for a single day," Margaret replied without hesitation. "It hasn't been easy. We've weathered droughts and blizzards, and the Panic of '73 nearly took everything. But we built this place together, stone by stone." Julia considered this as she worked. Her own dreams had always been more modest, a small schoolhouse, students eager to learn, perhaps someday a little cottage of her own. Never had she imagined herself on a cattle ranch in the Colorado wilderness. "And Mason?" Julia asked, trying to sound casual. "Has he worked for you long?" Margaret's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Mason Porter rode in about 5 years ago, half-starved and looking like he'd seen the devil himself. Daniel hired him on the spot, said he could recognize a good man when he saw one, no matter the packaging." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Mason doesn't talk much about his past, but I gather it wasn't easy. Lost his family young, from what little he's said." Julia nodded, absorbing this information and trying not to examine why it interested her so much. "He's the finest foreman in 3 counties, Margaret continued. "Loyal as they come. The men respect him, and that's saying something out here." Before Julia could respond, little Sarah burst into the kitchen, her blonde braids flying behind her. "Riders coming! Lots of them!" Julia and Margaret moved to the window, peering out at the dust cloud approaching from the east. Margaret's face broke into a relieved smile. "It's the men, back from the northern pastures," she explained. "They've been moving the herd to summer grazing." Julia's heart quickened inexplicably as she watched the approaching riders. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Mason had left, and despite her best efforts, she found herself thinking of him often, his kind eyes, his steadying presence, the way he had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't even known she was offering. The men rode into the yard, a weather-beaten group of about 15 cowboys. Julia scanned their faces, looking for Mason's tall figure. "He's not with them," Margaret said softly, reading Julia's thoughts. "Mason would have gone straight to Summit Springs to arrange supplies for the big drive next month. He'll likely be back tomorrow or the next day." Julia felt her cheeks warm at being so transparent. "I was just curious if everyone made it back safely." Margaret patted her hand gently. "Of course, dear." That evening, after the children were tucked into bed, Julia sat on the front porch with her journal, attempting to capture the majesty of the sunset over the mountains. The ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse after dinner, and the main house was quiet except for Daniel and Margaret's soft conversation drifting through an open window. Julia had just closed her journal when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. A lone rider was making his way up the drive, his silhouette unmistakable even in the fading light. Mason? Julia stood, smoothing her skirt self-consciously as he dismounted and led his horse toward the barn. He hadn't seen her yet, and for a moment she considered slipping back into the house to avoid appearing eager for his return. But then he turned, sensing her presence, and even in the gathering darkness she could see his smile. "Miss Murphy," he called, tying his horse to the hitching post and approaching the porch. "Still here, I see." "Did you expect me to run off?" she asked, returning his smile. "Wasn't sure if ranch life would suit a Boston lady," he admitted, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. His face was more tan than before, and several days' worth of stubble darkened his jaw. "I'm discovering I'm more adaptable than I thought," Julia replied. "The children are wonderful, and Mrs. Hollister has been very kind." Mason nodded, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "They think highly of you, too. Daniel rode out to the north pasture last week and said the young'uns wouldn't stop talking about their lessons." A warm glow of pride spread through Julia's chest. "They're bright children. They deserve a proper education." As do all children, Mason agreed. He seemed about to say more when the front door opened and Daniel Hollister stepped onto the porch. "Thought I heard your voice, Porter," Daniel said warmly. "Didn't expect you back till tomorrow." "Got the supplies ordered faster than anticipated," Mason replied. "Figured I'd rather sleep in my own bunk than another night at that flea trap they call a hotel in town." Daniel laughed. "Well, you're just in time. Margaret saved you some supper. Come on in." Julia watched as the two men disappeared into the house, struck by how at ease they seemed with each other, more like brothers than employer and employee. She remained on the porch a few minutes longer, enjoying the cool evening air and trying to sort through the confusing flutter of emotions Mason's return had stirred in her. It was foolish, she told herself sternly. She barely knew the man, and she was here to teach, to rebuild her life, not to moon over a cowboy like some lovesick girl in a penny dreadful novel. With that resolution firmly in mind, Julia went inside, said her goodnights, and retired to her room. But sleep was slow in coming, and when it did, her dreams were filled with rushing rivers and a deep voice saying words that seemed to reach into her very soul. The next few days settled into a rhythm. Julia taught the children in the mornings, helped Margaret with household tasks in the afternoons, and in the evenings she often found herself on the porch, sometimes alone with her thoughts, sometimes engaged in conversation with whoever happened to join her. Increasingly, that someone was Mason. He would appear after the day's work was done, hat in hand, asking if she minded company. They would talk as the sun set about books. He was surprisingly well read for a cowboy, about the East, which he had visited once as a young man, about the children's progress, about everything except personal matters. Mason never spoke of his past, and Julia never pressed. She sensed that, like her, he carried wounds that were still tender to the touch. A week after his return, Julia was walking back from the chicken coop with a basket of fresh eggs when she spotted Mason by the corral, working with a spirited young mare. She paused to watch as he moved with the animal, his voice too low for her to hear the words, but his tone soothing even at a distance. The mare, a beautiful Palomino, seemed to respond to his patience, gradually allowing him to approach and finally to stroke her golden neck. "She's magnificent," Julia called, once it seemed safe to interrupt. Mason looked up, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "She is that. Daniel bought her from a breeder in Denver last month. Still too green to ride, but she's got spirit." "What's her name?" Julia asked, approaching the fence. "Doesn't have one yet," Mason replied, giving the mare a final pat before joining Julia at the fence. "Daniel says naming rights go to whoever gentles her enough to ride. You seem to have a way with her already." Mason shrugged modestly. "Animals are straightforward. They don't play games or hide their feelings. Treat them with respect, they'll return the favor." "Unlike people," Julia suggested gently. A shadow crossed Mason's face. "Some people, anyway." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the mare pranced around the corral, occasionally tossing her golden mane. "I've been meaning to ask," Mason said finally. "Have you given any thought to what you'll do when the baby comes? Margaret will have her hands full, and Daniel was talking about hiring someone from town to help with the children." Julia's heart sank. She hadn't considered that her position might be temporary. I suppose I hadn't thought that far ahead." "Because," Mason continued, "I mentioned to Daniel that the town still needs a teacher. The school board's nephew lasted exactly 17 days before deciding frontier life wasn't to his liking." Julia stared at him in surprise. "But they already rejected me." "That was before they got desperate," Mason pointed out with a wry smile. "The new term's supposed to start in September, and they've got no one. I may have mentioned to Daniel, who mentioned to Judge Wilson, who happens to chair the school board, that they had a qualified teacher right under their noses." "You did that for me?" Julia asked, touched by his thoughtfulness. Mason looked slightly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Wasn't just for you. Those town children need education as much as the Hollister young'uns, and you deserve the position you came all this way for." Before Julia could respond, they heard Margaret calling from the house. The moment broken, they walked back together, Julia's mind spinning with this new possibility. 2 days later, Julia received an official letter from the Summit Springs School Board, offering her the teaching position she had originally come for. The salary was modest, but it included use of the small cabin behind the schoolhouse. She would start in September, giving her time to help Margaret through the baby's arrival in August. "I knew they'd come around," Mason said that evening when she shared the news. They were sitting on the porch steps, watching as fireflies began to dot the gathering darkness. "Only because you intervened," Julia pointed out. "I still don't understand why you've gone to such trouble for me." Mason was quiet for so long that Julia thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual. "When I found you by that river," he said, "you reminded me of someone." "Who?" Julia asked, equally soft. "Myself," he admitted, staring out at the darkening ranch yard. 10 years ago, I was at my own riverbank, figuratively speaking. Lost everything: family, home, purpose. Didn't see much point in going on. Julia held her breath, afraid that any interruption might cause him to retreat back into his customary reserve. "Daniel Hollister found me in a saloon in Cheyenne, drunk and looking for a fight," Mason continued. "Instead of throwing me out like he should have, he offered me a job. Said a man with that much anger either needed to find purpose or he'd find an early grave." A smile ghosted across his face. "I figured I'd take the job long enough to sober up, then move on. That was 5 years ago." "He saw something in you," Julia observed. "He saw a man worth saving," Mason corrected. "And when I saw you by that river, I thought maybe I could pass that forward." The simple honesty of his words moved her deeply. Without thinking, Julia placed her hand over his where it rested on the porch step between them. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for the job, but for stopping that day. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't." Mason turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining with a naturalness that should have shocked her, but somehow didn't. "The water runs toward our future," he repeated his words from the first meeting. "I believe that, Julia, even when it seems like we're drowning." They sat in silence as darkness settled completely around them, hands joined, each lost in their own thoughts, but somehow feeling less alone than before. The weeks leading up to the birth of Margaret's baby were busy ones. Julia divided her time between teaching the children, helping Margaret prepare for the new arrival, and making plans for her move to the schoolhouse in September. The school board had sent her the curriculum they expected her to follow, which she found woefully inadequate, and immediately began expanding. "You're going to revolutionize that schoolhouse," Margaret observed one afternoon, as Julia outlined her plans. "Those old men on the board won't know what hit them." "I'll be diplomatic," Julia promised with a smile. "But these children deserve more than just basic reading and ciphering. They deserve literature and history and science, a window to the wider world." Margaret squeezed her hand affectionately. "I'm going to miss having you here, but I can't think of anyone better to educate the children of Summit Springs." As her departure from the ranch grew closer, Julia found herself seeking out Mason's company more frequently. Their evening conversations on the porch had become something she looked forward to throughout the day, a time when they could share thoughts and observations without the pressures of their respective duties. They never again spoke as openly as they had the night she received the school board's letter, but something had shifted between them, a mutual understanding, a trust that deepened with each passing day. One evening in early August, just as the sun was setting, Mason appeared at the porch with an unexpected proposal. "I thought you might like to see more of the ranch before you leave for town," he said, an uncharacteristic hint of nervousness in his voice. "There's a spot up on the north ridge that gives a view of the whole valley. We could ride up tomorrow if you'd like." Julia hesitated only briefly. Riding alone with a man would have been scandalous back in Boston, but frontier life operated under different rules, and Mason had proven himself to be nothing if not honorable. "I'd like that very much," she said. The next morning, they set out after breakfast, Mason on his chestnut gelding, and Julia on a gentle mare borrowed from the Hollister stable. The day was perfect for riding clear skies, a light breeze, and the promise of summer warmth, without oppressive heat. As they rode side by side through verdant meadows dotted with wildflowers, Julia felt a sense of freedom she had never experienced before. In Boston, ladies didn't ride astride as she was doing now, and they certainly didn't spend hours in the company of a man without a chaperone. Yet here she was, defying all the social conventions she had been raised with, and feeling more alive than ever. "You ride well," Mason observed as they began the gradual ascent toward the ridge. Did you learn in Boston? Julia laughed. Hardly. Ladies in Boston ride side saddle in parks, not through wild country. Mrs. Hollister's been teaching me since I arrived. She says no woman can survive out here without knowing how to handle a horse. She's right about that, Mason agreed. Though I can't imagine you riding side saddle. Seems impractical. It is, Julia confirmed, like most things expected of proper Boston ladies. They continued upward, the trail narrowing as they climbed. Julia was struck by how at ease Mason seemed in this landscape, reading the terrain, pointing out landmarks, identifying birds and plants she would have overlooked. How did you learn all this? She asked, as he showed her tracks left by a mountain lion. Necessity, he replied with a shrug. When you live off the land, you learn to read it, or you don't survive long. Did you grow up in the West? Mason hesitated before answering, and Julia wondered if she had overstepped. He rarely volunteered personal information. Born in Kentucky, he said finally. My father had a small horse farm. When I was 12, he decided to try his luck farther west. We ended up in Kansas. His expression darkened. That's where they died. Fever took my mother and sisters in '66. Father lasted another year before his heart gave out. I'm sorry, Julia said softly, thinking of her own parents gone so recently. I lost my parents to influenza 2 years ago. Mason nodded, a look of understanding passing between them. It changes you, he said simply. Makes you realize how fragile everything is. The trail widened as they neared the top of the ridge, and soon they emerged onto a grassy plateau that overlooked the entire valley. The Double H Ranch spread out below them, buildings looking like toys from this height. Beyond it lay Summit Springs, and further still, the vast expanse of plains stretching toward the horizon. It's breathtaking, Julia breathed, dismounting to get a better view. Mason tied their horses to a nearby tree before joining her at the edge of the ridge. Worth the ride? Absolutely, she affirmed, her eyes trying to take in the panoramic vista. I can see why you love it here. They stood in companionable silence, watching as clouds cast moving shadows across the landscape below. A hawk circled lazily overhead, riding the thermal currents rising from the valley floor. I wanted to show you this, Mason said after a while, so you'd understand what I see when I look at this land. It's not just grass and trees and mountains. It's possibility. Julia glanced at him, struck by the passion in his voice. In that moment, with the sun highlighting the strong planes of his face and the breeze ruffling his dark hair, she thought he was the most handsome man she had ever seen. But it was more than that. It was the quiet strength he radiated, the thoughtfulness behind his words, the way he saw the world, not just as it was, but as it could be. I understand, she said softly. It's the same way I feel when I look at a child learning something new. The possibility of what they might become with the right guidance. Mason turned to her, something unreadable in his blue eyes. We're not so different, you and I. Before Julia could respond, a distant roll of thunder interrupted the moment. They both looked toward the western horizon, where dark clouds were gathering with alarming speed. Summer storm, Mason said, his expression turning serious. We need to get back. They can turn dangerous quickly out here. They mounted quickly and set off down the trail, moving at a faster pace than they had on the ascent. The wind picked up, bringing with it the scent of rain and electricity. Julia's mare grew skittish as another closer rumble of thunder shook the air. Stay close, Mason called over his shoulder as fat raindrops began to fall. They were about halfway down the ridge when the storm hit in earnest. Rain fell in blinding sheets, turning the trail slick with mud. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed immediately by deafening thunder. Julia's mare reared in fright, nearly unseating her. Mason! She cried, struggling to control the panicked animal. He was beside her in an instant, grabbing her mare's bridle and speaking soothingly to the frightened horse. We need shelter, he shouted over the storm. There's a line shack about a quarter-mile east. Can you make it? Julia nodded, clinging to her saddle, as Mason led her horse off the trail and through a stand of pines. The trees provided some shelter from the driving rain, but lightning continued to split the sky at alarming intervals. The line shack appeared suddenly through the trees, a small, sturdy cabin, used by ranch hands when working in distant pastures. Mason dismounted quickly, helped Julia down, and led both horses to a lean to attach to one side of the cabin. Only when the animals were secured did they dash for the cabin's door. Inside, it was dry but cold. The cabin consisted of a single room with a small stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot against one wall. Mason immediately set about lighting a fire, while Julia stood dripping by the door, her dress sodden and her hair plastered to her face. "There should be some dry clothes in that trunk," Mason said, nodding toward a wooden chest as flames began to catch in the fireplace. "Ranch hands keep spare things here. Won't fit well, but they'll be dry." Julia hesitated only briefly before her practical nature asserted itself. Being modest was less important than avoiding pneumonia. "Turn around, please," she requested. Mason obliged, busying himself with building up the fire, as Julia quickly changed into a flannel shirt and trousers that were comically large on her slender frame. She used a length of rope from the trunk as a belt and rolled up the sleeves and pant legs. "You can turn around now," she said when she was decent. Mason glanced at her and quickly looked away, but not before she caught the hint of a smile. "You should hang your dress by the fire to dry." While Julia arranged her sodden garments on a chair near the hearth, Mason checked the cabin's meager supplies. "Not much here," he reported. "Some coffee, jerky, and beans. But we've got water and shelter, which is what matters." Outside, the storm continued to rage, rain lashing against the small windows and thunder shaking the cabin's sturdy walls. Julia moved closer to the fire, grateful for its warmth as she worked to untangle her wet hair with her fingers. "Here," Mason said, offering her a tin cup of water. "It's not hot tea, but it's something." Their fingers brushed as she accepted the cup, sending an unexpected shiver through her that had nothing to do with her damp condition. "Thank you." Mason took a seat on the floor near the fire, maintaining a respectful distance. "Storm like this could last hours," he said, his expression apologetic. "We might be here a while." Julia nodded, trying to ignore the impropriety of their situation. She was alone in a remote cabin with a man, wearing men's clothing, with no certainty of when they might return to the ranch. It was the stuff of ruined reputations, and yet, strangely, she wasn't afraid, not of Mason at least. "I trust you," she said quietly, almost to herself. Mason looked at her sharply, as if he'd heard the thought rather than the words. "I would never do anything to harm you, Julia, or your reputation." "I know," she affirmed, meeting his gaze steadily. "That's why I'm not worried." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the continuing storm outside. Julia found herself studying Mason's profile as he stared into the flames, noting the straight line of his nose, the slight cleft in his chin, the way his eyelashes cast shadows on his cheeks. "Tell me about Boston," he said suddenly, glancing at her. "What was your life like there?" Julia smiled, surprised by the request but happy to fill the time with conversation. "Quiet compared to here. After my parents died, I lived with my aunt, teaching at a girls' school. The days were very structured. Lessons in the morning, tea at precisely 3 o'clock, dinner at 7, needlework in the evenings." "Sounds stifling," Mason observed. "It could be," Julia admitted. "But there were compensations, museums, libraries, concerts. I miss those sometimes." "No suitors?" Mason asked, then looked immediately embarrassed at his directness. "Forgive me, that's not my business." Julia laughed softly. "It's all right, and no, not really. There was a gentleman, a colleague at the school, who expressed interest, but," she shrugged, "I didn't feel for him what a woman should feel for her husband." "And what should a woman feel?" Mason asked quietly. Julia met his eyes, her heart suddenly racing. "I think she should feel that her life would be less without him in it, that he truly sees her for who she is, not who society expects her to be." The intensity in Mason's gaze made her breath catch. "And have you ever felt that way about anyone?" he asked, his voice lower than before. Before Julia could answer, a particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, causing them both to jump. The moment broken, Mason stood and moved to check the windows. "Storm's moving east," he observed. "Should clear up soon." Julia nodded. Aware that they had been on the verge of a conversation that would have crossed boundaries she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Yet, part of her regretted the interruption, wondering what might have been said if the wind hadn't intervened. By late afternoon, the storm had passed, leaving behind a freshly washed landscape bathed in golden sunlight. Julia's dress was still damp, but dry enough to be wearable for the ride back. She changed quickly while Mason checked on the horses, then joined him outside. "Everything all right?" she asked, noting his serious expression. "Fine," he assured her. "Just thinking we should get back before dark. Daniel and Margaret will be worried." The ride back to the ranch was quieter than their outbound journey, both of them seemingly lost in thought. The near moment in the cabin hung between them, unacknowledged but impossible to forget. As they approached the ranch, Mason suddenly spoke. "Julia, about earlier." "There they are!" Margaret's voice called from the porch, interrupting whatever he had been about to say. Daniel strode toward them, relief evident on his face. "Thank God. We were about to send out a search party. That storm came up so fast." "We took shelter in the North Ridgeline shack," Mason explained as they dismounted. "Sorry to worry you." "As long as you're both safe," Margaret said, embracing Julia. "Come inside, you must be starving." As they walked toward the house, Mason's hand briefly touched the small of Julia's back, a gesture so subtle it might have been accidental, but the warmth of it stayed with her through dinner, through the evening, and into her dreams that night. 3 days later, in the early hours before dawn, Margaret went into labor. The baby, a healthy boy named Joseph, arrived just after noon, bringing joy to the entire household. Julia found herself unexpectedly moved as she watched Daniel cradle his newborn son, his weathered face transformed by wonder and love. "You'll stay on until September, won't you?" Margaret asked the next day as Julia helped her settle the baby. "I know the school board wants you to start preparations, but of course I'll stay," Julia assured her. "I wouldn't dream of leaving you now." The following weeks passed in a blur of baby care, continued lessons for the older children, and preparations for Julia's move to Summit Springs. Mason was often absent, busy with ranch operations, but he made a point of seeking her out each evening, even if only for a few minutes of conversation on the porch. They never again came as close to the intimacy they had shared in the line shack, but something had shifted between them, a deeper awareness, a current of unspoken feeling that made even casual interactions charged with meaning. As August drew to a close, Julia found herself increasingly torn about leaving the ranch. She had grown to love the Hollister family, the rhythm of ranch life, and though she scarcely admitted it to herself, the quiet moments with Mason. Yet she also yearned for the independence of having her own home and classroom, of fulfilling the purpose that had brought her west in the first place. The evening before she was to leave for Summit Springs, Julia sat alone on the porch, watching the sunset and trying to sort through her conflicted emotions. She had already packed her few belongings, said her goodbyes to the children, and promised Margaret she would visit regularly. Only one goodbye remained, and it was the one she dreaded most. As if summoned by her thoughts, Mason appeared from the direction of the barn, his tall figure silhouetted against the dying light. He climbed the porch steps slowly, hat in hand, and sat beside her on the bench. "All packed?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes," Julia replied. "Daniel's driving me into town after breakfast tomorrow." Mason nodded, turning his hat in his hands. "The schoolhouse cabin is ready. Some of the town ladies cleaned it up last week. It's small, but it should be comfortable enough. Thank you for arranging that." They lapsed into silence, the air between them heavy with things unsaid. Julia wanted to tell him how much his friendship had meant to her, how he had changed her life by finding her that day by the river, how the thought of not seeing him every day created an ache in her chest she couldn't explain, but the words wouldn't come. "I have something for you," Mason said finally, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small object and placed it in her palm. It was a silver brooch in the shape of a river. The metal worked to suggest flowing water. Simple but beautiful, it caught the last rays of sunlight and seemed to shimmer with movement. "Mason," Julia breathed, deeply touched. "It's beautiful." "Had it made in town," he explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "Thought it might remind you." "Of the river?" she asked. His eyes met hers, blue and earnest. "Of where our paths crossed. Of the water running toward our future." Julia felt tears prick behind her eyes. "I could never forget that," she whispered. Mason reached out slowly, his fingertips just brushing her cheek. "Julia, The front door opened suddenly, and they both startled, moving apart as Daniel stepped onto the porch. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, looking between them with knowing eyes. "Margaret was wondering if you could help with the baby, Julia. He's fussing something fierce." "Of course," Julia said quickly, closing her hand around the brooch and standing. "Excuse me?" As she hurried inside, she heard Daniel say something to Mason in a low voice, followed by Mason's even softer reply. But the words were lost to her as she climbed the stairs, her heart pounding with a confusing mixture of longing and regret. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect late summer day. Julia wore her best dress, the brown traveling outfit she had arrived in, now carefully mended and pressed, with Mason's silver brooch pinned at her collar. Her trunk was loaded into Daniel's wagon. Goodbyes were said amid tears, mostly from the children and Margaret, and then they were off, the ranch growing smaller in the distance as they headed towards Summit Springs. Julia was silent for much of the journey, lost in thoughts of what might have been said if Daniel hadn't interrupted the previous evening. Mason hadn't come to see them off, having ridden out at first light to check on a broken fence line, according to Daniel. "He's not good with goodbyes," Daniel said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "Never has been." Julia looked at him in surprise. "I'm sure he's very busy," Daniel chuckled. "Not too busy to spend the last 3 evenings in town, talking to the silversmith about designing that brooch you're wearing." Heat rushed to Julia's cheeks. "He mentioned it was made in town. Designed it himself, from what I hear," Daniel continued, keeping his eyes on the road. "Something about a river flowing toward the future." Julia's fingers went instinctively to the brooch. "He told you about that?" "Didn't have to," Daniel replied with a smile. "I was there that day, remember? Saw him ride in with a bedraggled young lady behind him, both of you soaking wet from the river. And I heard what he said to you on the bank." Julia stared at him in confusion. "You were at the river?" Daniel shook his head. "No, at our place, when Mason brought you to us." "But," Julia frowned. "That's not where we met. He found me crying by the Sweetwater River after I learned the teaching position had been given to someone else." Now it was Daniel's turn to look confused. "The Sweetwater? That's a good 15 miles from here. Mason never mentioned finding you there." Julia's mind raced, trying to make sense of this new information. "He said he was the Hollisters' foreman, that he could put in a good word for me as a tutor." "Which he did," Daniel confirmed. "But the way he told it, he met you in town after you'd learned about the teaching position. Said you were down on your luck and needed work." "But that's not—" Julia trailed off, bewildered. "Why would he change the story?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, then said gently, "Perhaps he thought it was your story to tell, not his. Mason's like that, respects people's privacy because he values his own so highly." They rode in silence for a while, Julia turning this revelation over in her mind. It was a small thing, really a detailed change in the telling of how they met, but it suggested a sensitivity, a consideration for her dignity that touched her deeply. By the time they reached Summit Springs, Julia had made a decision. After helping her settle into the schoolhouse cabin, Daniel prepared to leave. "Daniel," Julia said as he climbed onto the wagon, "when you see Mason, would you tell him something from me?" "Of course. Tell him." She hesitated, then continued firmly, "Tell him I'll be at the Sweetwater River on Sunday afternoon, where he found me, if he'd like to continue our conversation." Daniel's face broke into a wide smile. "I'll tell him." Sunday dawned crisp and clear, the first hint of autumn in the air. Julia spent the morning pacing her small cabin, alternating between certainty that she was making a fool of herself and hope that Mason would come. After church, she changed into her best dress, a new blue calico she had purchased with her first advance from the school board, and pinned the river brooch at her collar. Then she set out for the Sweetwater, following the directions she had obtained from the general store owner. The spot looked different in the bright afternoon sunlight than it had that fateful evening when Mason found her. The river flowed clear and sparkling, cottonwood trees rustled in the gentle breeze, and wildflowers dotted the grassy bank, where she had sat sobbing over her shattered dreams. Julia settled on a large rock near the water's edge, arranging her skirts neatly and trying to calm her racing heart. She had no guarantee that Mason would come. Daniel might not have delivered her message, or Mason might have decided not to respond. An hour passed, then another. The sun began its westward descent, casting longer shadows across the river. Julia fought against disappointment, telling herself she would wait until sunset before giving up. Just as she was about to leave, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her turn. Mason appeared on the ridge above the river, his figure unmistakable even at a distance. He dismounted and descended the slope on foot, moving with the easy grace that had become so familiar to her. "You came," Julia said as he approached, unable to keep the relief from her voice. "Of course I came," Mason replied, stopping a few feet away. He looked different somehow, freshly shaven, wearing a clean shirt she hadn't seen before. "Though I admit I was surprised by your message. Daniel told me something interesting," Julia said, gathering her courage, "about the day we met." A flicker of understanding crossed Mason's face. You changed the story when you told them. Why?" Mason looked out across the river, his expression thoughtful. "You were distraught that day, vulnerable. It didn't seem right to share that with others, even the Hollisters. You were protecting my dignity," Julia realized aloud. He glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I was respecting your privacy. Everyone has the right to keep their darker moments to themselves." "Like you do with your past?" Julia asked gently. Mason's smile faded. "Some things are better left buried." "Not always," Julia countered, taking a step toward him. "Not when they're part of what makes you who you are." They stood facing each other, the river murmuring beside them, the setting sun painting the landscape in gold and amber. In that moment, Julia felt as if they were poised on the edge of something momentous, as if the current that had brought them together was about to carry them into uncharted waters. "Why did you ask me here, Julia?" Mason asked, his voice lower than before. "Because we never finished our conversation," she said simply. "The night before I left the ranch." Mason's eyes held hers, searching. "And what would you have said if we hadn't been interrupted?" Julia took a deep breath. "I would have said that I've never met anyone like you. That you changed everything for me that day by the river, not just by helping me find a position, but by showing me kindness when I needed it most, by seeing me, truly seeing me, when I felt invisible." Mason stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "And I would have said that, from the moment I saw you here, something changed in me too. That you reminded me there's more to life than just surviving. That there's beauty and purpose even after loss." Julia's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "Is that why you gave me the brooch? To remind me of that day?" "Partly," Mason admitted, his hand reaching up to touch the silver river at her collar. "And partly to give you something to remember me by. I feared once you were settled in town, with your own life, you might not want a reminder of your time at the ranch." "Not want to remember?" Julia echoed in disbelief. "Mason, those weeks at the ranch were the happiest I've had since losing my parents, and you were a large part of that happiness." His hand moved from the brooch to gently cup her cheek. "I've never been good with words, Julia, but I need you to know that what I feel for you it's more than I thought I was capable of feeling again." Julia leaned into his touch, her own hand coming up to cover his. "Then show me," she whispered. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Mason lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a statement. But when Julia's arms wound around his neck, pulling him closer, it deepened into something more urgent, more honest than any words could have been. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the day in the line shack," he confessed. Julia smiled, feeling lightheaded with happiness. "I've wanted you to since that day too." They sat by the river as the sun set completely, talking as they never had before. Mason spoke of his years after losing his family, the aimless wandering, the odd jobs, the darkness that had nearly consumed him before Daniel Hollister offered him purpose. Julia shared her fears and hopes, her dreams for the school, her growing love for this wild, beautiful country that was so different from her Boston home. "What happens now?" Julia asked as twilight deepened around them. "I have the school, and you have the ranch." "Summit Springs is only 5 miles from the Double H," Mason pointed out. "I could ride that in my sleep. You'd come to town to see me. Every chance I get," he promised. "And perhaps, someday, if you decide I'm worth taking a chance on, We could build something together. Julia's heart swelled at the tentative hope in his voice. I already know you're worth taking a chance on, Mason Porter. He kissed her again, more confidently this time, and Julia felt as if the river itself was singing around them, carrying them toward a future neither could have imagined when they first met on this very spot. As darkness fell completely, they reluctantly prepared to leave. Mason helped Julia onto his horse, then mounted behind her for the ride back to town. You know what I think? Julia said as they rode through the starlit landscape. What's that? Mason asked, his arms secure around her waist. I think you were right that first day. The water does run toward our future. She turned slightly to see his face in the moonlight. And I think our future is just beginning. Mason's smile was all the answer she needed. The next few months passed in a blur of new experiences and deepening feelings. Julia threw herself into teaching, transforming the small Summit Springs schoolhouse into a place of genuine learning and discovery. Her students, initially wary of this Eastern lady with her fancy ideas, soon warmed to her passionate approach and genuine interest in their progress. Mason kept his promise, riding into town at least twice a week to see her. Sometimes they would have dinner at the hotel restaurant, sometimes just walk along the town's dusty streets, and sometimes sit on the small porch of her schoolhouse cabin, talking until the stars came out. Their courtship was unconventional by Boston standards, but it suited them perfectly. With each visit, each conversation, each shared moment, the bond between them grew stronger. Julia found herself counting the hours between his visits, her heart lifting at the first sight of his tall figure riding into town. News of their relationship spread quickly through Summit Springs and the surrounding ranches. Some eyebrows were raised at the schoolteacher, keeping company with a cowboy, but most people approved of the match. Mason was well respected throughout the territory, and Julia had quickly earned the community's trust with her dedication to their children's education. Mrs. Pendleton stopped me outside church today, Julia told Mason one Sunday afternoon, as they walked along the Sweetwater. It had become their tradition to meet at their spot by the river whenever weather permitted. She wanted to know when we'd be setting a date. Mason's eyebrows rose. Did she now? And what did you tell her? That it wasn't her business, Julia replied primly, then laughed at his surprised expression. Actually, I said we were in no hurry, which is true. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, hands linked between them. It was late November, and the air held a sharp chill that promised winter was not far off. The trees had shed their leaves, and the landscape had taken on the stark beauty of the coming season. Would you want to? Mason asked suddenly. Set a date, I mean. Julia stopped walking, turning to face him. Are you asking what I think you're asking, Mason Porter? A slow smile spread across his face. Not exactly, not yet, but I might be testing the waters. Well then, Julia said, matching his smile. If you were asking hypothetically, I might say yes, eventually. Eventually? Mason repeated thoughtfully. When would eventually be, in your mind? Julia considered the question seriously. When we've had time to be certain. When we know each other completely. She squeezed his hand. I don't need a ring or a promise right now, Mason. I'm happy with what we have. Mason lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. So am I. Happier than I've been in a very long time. That winter proved to be particularly harsh, with blizzards sweeping across the territory and temperatures dropping to bone-chilling levels. Travel between the ranch and town became difficult and sometimes impossible, forcing Mason and Julia to endure longer separations than they had become accustomed to. During one particularly brutal 3-week stretch in January, when the trails were completely impassable, Julia found herself missing Mason with an intensity that surprised her. She had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to stand on her own. Yet now, she found herself watching the road from town, hoping for a glimpse of his familiar figure. When he finally appeared one frigid afternoon, snow crusting his coat and hat, she ran to meet him without a thought for propriety or the curious eyes of her students who were just being dismissed for the day. You shouldn't have risked it, she scolded, even as she clung to him. The trails must be treacherous. Worth every danger, Mason replied, his cold lips finding hers briefly. I missed you, school teacher. That evening, as they sat before the fire in her small cabin, Mason unusually quiet, Julia sensed something had changed during their separation. He seemed more serious, more intent, as he watched her move around the small space, preparing their tea. "What is it?" she asked finally. "You've hardly said a word since you arrived." Mason set down his cup, his expression solemn. "Being apart from you these past weeks, it got me thinking." Julia's heart quickened. About how fragile life is out here, about how quickly everything can change. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it tightly in his fist. "About how I don't want to waste any more time being cautious." Julia's breath caught as he moved from his chair to kneel before her. "Mason, I know we said eventually," he continued, his blue eyes earnest, "and I'll understand if you still want to wait. But these weeks without you showed me that I don't want to spend another day not knowing that you're mine and I'm yours." He opened his hand to reveal a simple gold ring with a small, perfect sapphire. "It was my mother's," he explained softly. "The one thing I kept when I sold everything else after they died. I always thought I'd know when it was right to pass it on." Tears filled Julia's eyes as she looked from the ring to Mason's face. "And now you know?" "I've known since that day by the river," he admitted, "but I wanted to be sure you knew too. Julia Murphy, will you marry me?" The answer rose from her heart without hesitation. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." The ring slid onto her finger as if it had been made for her. Mason rose and pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love and promise that words could not express. When they finally broke apart, Julia laughed through her tears. "Mrs. Pendleton will be insufferable when she hears." Mason grinned, pressing his forehead to hers. "Let her be. I don't care what anyone thinks as long as you're happy." "I am," Julia assured him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Happier than I ever imagined possible." They were married in the Summit Springs Church on a bright April day when the worst of winter had passed and the first wildflowers were beginning to dot the prairie. Margaret Hollister, recovered from childbirth and radiant with happiness for her friends, stood as Julia's matron of honor. Daniel served as Mason's best man, little Joseph gurgling contentedly in his arms. The entire town turned out for the event, along with cowboys from the Double H and neighboring ranches. Even the school board members attended, their initial skepticism about the Eastern school teacher long since replaced by genuine respect. Julia wore a simple gown of ivory silk that Margaret had helped her sew, with Mason's Silver River brooch pinned at her throat and wildflowers in her hair. Mason, looking both uncomfortable and handsome in a new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle. "Never thought I'd see the day," Daniel murmured as they waited at the altar. Mason Porter, settling down. "Neither did I," Mason admitted quietly. "But then I found her crying by the river." After the ceremony, the entire town celebrated with a feast and dancing that lasted well into the night. When the newlyweds finally slipped away, it was to a surprise Daniel had arranged the North Ridgeline shack, transformed for the occasion, with fresh bedding, flowers, and provisions for several days. "Thought you might appreciate the privacy," Daniel told them with a wink as he handed Mason the key. And the memory. In the years that followed, Julia and Mason built a life together that neither could have imagined that first day by the Sweetwater. They purchased land halfway between the Double H and Summit Springs, building a sturdy house with a wide porch and rooms that gradually filled with the sound of children's laughter. Julia continued teaching until their first child, a daughter they named Sarah Margaret, arrived, then returned part-time as the school grew and required more teachers. Mason partnered with Daniel on breeding horses, developing a stock that became known throughout the territory for its strength and intelligence. They faced hardships, of course harsh winters, dry summers that threatened crops and livestock, the normal challenges of raising a family in the still Wild West. But they faced them together, their bond only strengthening with each obstacle overcome. On their 10th anniversary, Mason surprised Julia by taking her back to the spot on the Sweetwater where they had first met. Their children, Sarah, now 8, and twins James and Thomas, 5, were left in Margaret's capable care for the day. "It looks just the same," Julia marveled as they spread a picnic blanket on the grassy bank. "Some things don't change," Mason agreed, settling beside her and pulling her close against his side. "Like how I feel about you." Julia smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. At 32, she was no longer the frightened young woman he had found crying by the river, but a confident wife and mother, respected throughout the community for her contributions to education and her unwavering support of her husband's endeavors. Mason, too, had changed. The restlessness that had once driven him was gone, replaced by a deep contentment and purpose that showed in everything he did. At 40, his dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and lines fanned from the corners of his eyes, evidence of a life spent squinting into the sun, and, more often, smiling at his family. "Do you ever regret it?" Julia asked suddenly. "Settling down with a heartbroken schoolteacher when you could have kept your freedom?" Mason turned to look at her, his blue eyes as intense as they had been the first time they met. "Not for a single moment," he said firmly. "You were the best decision I ever made, Julia Porter." "Even when I insist on teaching the children Shakespeare?" she teased. "Or when I made you read all of Pride and Prejudice aloud last winter?" "Even then," he laughed, pulling her closer for a kiss. "Though I still think Mr. Darcy could have saved everyone a lot of trouble by speaking plainly from the start." They spent the afternoon by the river, reminiscing about the past decade and making plans for the future. Sarah was showing a remarkable aptitude for horses, taking after her father. James was the scholar, already reading at a level that astonished his teachers. And Thomas was the family comedian, keeping everyone laughing with his antics and observations. As the sun began to set, casting the same golden light over the landscape that had illuminated their first meaningful conversation, Mason took Julia's hand and led her to the water's edge. "I brought you something," he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small package wrapped in tissue paper and placed it in her palm. Julia unwrapped it carefully to reveal a second silver brooch, a perfect match to the one she still wore on special occasions. But this one was engraved on the back with their initials and the date they had met. "Oh, Mason," she breathed, deeply touched. "I had it made for our anniversary," he explained, "a reminder of where we started and how far we've come." Julia fastened the brooch to her dress, then wound her arms around his neck. "I love you, Mason Porter, more with each passing day." "And I love you," he replied, his voice husky with emotion. "You and the children, and the life we've built together, it's more than I ever dreamed possible." They stood together as darkness began to fall, the river flowing steadily beside them, carrying water from the mountains toward the distant plains, always moving, always flowing toward the future, just as Mason had said that first day. Julia thought of the frightened, heartbroken young woman who had sat on this bank 10 years ago, believing her future had ended before it began. How wrong she had been. How fortunate that a kindly cowboy had stopped to offer words of hope that had proved to be so prophetic. "The water runs toward our future," she murmured, echoing his words from the day. Mason smiled, wrapping his arm around her waist as they turned to walk back to their horses. "And what a beautiful future it is." Hand in hand, they rode away from the river, toward home, toward their children, toward all the years yet to come, years that would hold more joy, more challenges, more love than either could imagine. But whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Carried forward by the current that had brought them to each other that fateful day by the Sweetwater River. And in the end, that was all that mattered.